Good evening, and welcome to Twilight Tale. Tonight, you don't need to learn, remember, or stay alert. You only need to listen and let your thoughts drift. As the modern world fades, we travel back thousands of years to the banks of the Nile. Not to the temples or the tombs, but to the quiet spaces in between. The homes where families gathered, the courtyards where children played, the kitchens where bread was baked at dawn. In this story, we will gently explore how ordinary people in ancient Egypt lived their daily lives, how their homes were built, how families were organized, and how simple traditions shaped their evenings, much like ours do today. There is nothing you need to imagine perfectly, no details to hold on to. Just allow the rhythm of the past to slow your breathing and carry you toward rest. Now, let us begin. It is said that some places do not simply exist in the world, they teach the world how to move. In a quiet quarter of an ancient Egyptian town, where walls hold back the day's glare and the air begins to cool, there is a courtyard, open to the sky, enclosed by memory. The sun has already lowered its voice. A faint wind drifts in from the river's direction, carrying the taste of wet reeds and far-off silt. Above the house, the first star appears like a pinprick in darkening linen. Beneath it, the courtyard stones, warmed all afternoon, release their heat slowly, as if the earth itself is learning to exhale. Beneath the silence, the courtyard waits like a shallow bowl, cradling whatever the day brought home. The walls around it are not monumental, they are not carved from eternity, they are mudbrick, humble, sun-baked, and dust-colored, made from Nile earth pressed into shape and left to harden beneath the same sky that now turns violet. In Egypt, stone was reserved for what must endure beyond a lifetime: temples, tombs, the architecture of forever, while the living built their days from materials that could be remade, repaired, and returned to soil. And yet, in the softening light, this ordinary courtyard feels like a sanctuary. It is a space without a roof, but not without shelter. Here, the home holds the sky in its center. Here, evening arrives gently, stepping over thresholds, slipping through doorways, finding its way into every corner. Whispers tell us that the ancient Egyptian home was shaped less by haste than by rhythm, not by the desire to conquer time, but to live inside it. The courtyard was the heart, a place where air could circulate, where work could unfold, where the day could be witnessed as it turned and turned again. Houses were often arranged around such an open space, an inward-facing world that softened the outer heat and gathered the family's life into one breathing center. So imagine the hour just after sunset. The courtyard floor is swept, not spotless but tended, dust guided into corners, stray reed fragments lifted away, the remains of the day shaped into order. A clay jar sits in the shade of a wall, its curved shoulder catching the last amber light. Nearby, woven mats lie rolled and ready, like small horizons waiting to be unrolled beneath tired bodies. Low stools, plain wood, smoothed by years, stand as patient as animals at rest. A doorway opens onto a dim chamber, another leads to a storeroom where jars wait with grain and beer, another, perhaps, to a narrow stair that climbs toward the roof, where night air can be caught like water in the hands. The house does not announce itself, it listens. And as the sky deepens, the household begins its slow return to the courtyard, as rivers return to the sea. Children come first, not as a procession, but as a drift of motion, soft feet, quick laughter that is already lowering into the evening's hush. They trace patterns in the dust with their fingertips, spirals, lines, small circles that look like moons, as if their hands remember something older than their names. Their games do not need much. A pebble becomes a star. A broken shard becomes a boat. In the corner, a stone grinder rests on the ground, and beside it, a woman's hands begin their steady work. Grain meets stone. The motion is circular, unhurried, like a planet turning. The sound is not loud, more a murmur, a soft rasp that becomes part of the courtyard's pulse. Each rotation is a kind of prayer without words, nourishment made by patience. Where memory fades, the simplest acts become sacred because they repeat, because they endure, because they happen again tomorrow and the day after. A man returns as the light thins further. His skin holds the river's dampness. His hair carries a faint scent of mud and sun. If he has come from fields, there is dust on his calves. If from the water, there may be a sheen like silver along his arms. He does not enter like a conqueror. He enters like a returning note in a familiar song. The courtyard receives him without ceremony. It is not a throne room. It is better than that. It is the place where a life is allowed to be ordinary. And in this ordinariness, something vast is being practiced. The Egyptians had a word for balance, ma'at. It was not only an idea, but a principle felt in the bones of the world. Truth, harmony, rightness, the steady alignment of what should be. Ma'at was imagined as cosmic order, what keeps stars in their paths, seasons in their turn, and human life from dissolving into chaos. In temples, Ma'at was upheld with rituals and offerings, in courts with judgments, in the king's mouth with decrees. But in the courtyard, Ma'at had smaller clothes. It lived in how water was shared, how bread was divided, how a doorway was kept clear, how a child was comforted when the night wind sounded strange. Here, balance was not spoken, it was done. Notice the objects, not as props, but as companions. A lamp, clay-bodied, its wick darkened, its oil waiting. A bowl, chipped at the rim, still useful, still beloved. A jar, sealed with mud and cloth, holding the sweetness of dates or the bitterness of beer. These things were not merely items. In a house built from earth, everything carried the intimacy of earth. Each vessel remembered the hand that shaped it, the fire that hardened it, the journeys it made across floors like this. Even the architecture participates in this quiet choreography. Mudbrick walls thicken against heat. Palm beam roofs hold shade and make rooms cool. Doorways and passages guide movement, shaping how a family meets, how sound travels, how silence is kept. The home becomes a kind of instrument played by daylight and darkness, and the courtyard, open to the sky, marks the turning of time more faithfully than any spoken schedule. The sun has its path. The shadows lengthen along the walls like slow ink. The first stars arrive. The air becomes a softer fabric. The courtyard is a clock made of breath. Marked by the moon, the household shifts again. Food is prepared and shared, not in a rush, not in spectacle. The meal is a gathering of small satisfactions. The child who was restless grows heavy-eyed. The older ones speak less, as if words cost more in the dark and must be chosen carefully. Somewhere nearby, perhaps in a corner niche, perhaps on a small raised shelf, there may be a household shrine. It need not be grand. Often, private devotion in ancient Egypt took place outside the great temple interiors, through small objects, offerings, and rituals that brought the gods closer to daily life. A figurine may stand there, protective, watchful, a small image, a bowl for offerings, a trace of incense. The household's gods might be the ones who stand nearest to fear, guardians of mothers and infants, watchers in the night, helpers against illness and misfortune. Even if no one speaks their names aloud, the corner feels different, as if the air there is more attentive. Whispers tell us that the walls could listen, not in a superstitious way only, but in a human way, the sense that a home remembers, that a house, like a body, holds echoes, laughter that once burst out like water, grief that once sat in the corner like a stone, voices of elders who are gone, footsteps of children who have grown. Mudbrick absorbs more than heat, it absorbs life. And yet, contradictions live here too, as quietly as dust. There is poverty beside devotion, a jar that is half empty, a roof beam that needs replacing, a room that crowds too many sleepers, fragility beside eternity, the knowledge that this home, made of Nile earth, will not last forever, even as those who live within it dream of permanence in the next world. This is part of the Egyptian understanding too: stone for the gods and the dead, mudbrick for the living. So the courtyard becomes a tender paradox. It is temporary, and it is everything. It is small, and it holds the sky. Late evening settles deeper. The last glow is gone from the horizon. Above, the stars feel closer now, as if the roofless space invites them in. The courtyard's warmth fades into coolness. The family's motions become fewer, more economical. A mat is unrolled, a blanket is shaken out, a jar is moved nearer to the wall, and then the lamp is lit. The flame is not large, it does not defeat the dark, it makes a small treaty with it. Light touches stone, dust, and the curve of a clay vessel. Shadows gather behind objects like quiet animals. The courtyard becomes a chamber of moving gold. In that soft glow, everything looks older, more mythic. Every crack in the wall a riverbed, every grain of dust a century. The home seems to pause, as if listening for something beyond itself. Perhaps a prayer is whispered, perhaps only a thought is offered, not because anyone expects thunder in reply, but because the night feels vast, and it is human to place a small word into vastness. The lamp flickers, and the courtyard flickers with it, as if the house is breathing. Outside these walls, the town settles too, dogs quieting, distant voices thinning, the river continuing without announcement. Inside, the household drifts toward sleep in the way a boat drifts into reeds, slowly, guided by familiarity, held by gentle boundaries. And the courtyard remains at the center, open to the heavens, holding the last warmth of day like a secret kept for those who need it. Perhaps the ancient Egyptian home did not hold the day as it slipped into night by resisting the dark. Perhaps it simply made a place where the turning could happen without fear, a space where work softened into rest, where voices lowered into silence,
where Mott was practiced not in proclamations, but in the steady care of ordinary life. And if you listen closely, beneath the silence, you might hear it still, the faint sound of grain against stone, the hush of feet on swept earth, the soft persuasion of a lamp flame. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. Perhaps it was never meant to be found, only felt, like evening learning again and again how to breathe. It is said that every true home begins with a threshold, low, worn, sacred, not because it is grand, but because it asks you to bow. You arrive at it when the day has loosened its grip. The outside world still murmurs, distant voices, a dog's brief call, the faint suggestion of river wind, but here, at this small lip of stone and packed earth, the sound seems to fall away. Sandals pause, dust clings to the ankle like a quiet oath, and for a breath you feel it, the moment when the world is left behind, not with drama, but with a soft closing of the heart's door. Beneath the silence, the house waits. Its walls are close, built from mudbrick, Nile earth shaped by hands, dried under relentless sun, then raised into rooms meant for living, not immortality. In ancient Egypt, stone was often reserved for temples and tombs, the architecture of permanence, while domestic life unfolded inside materials that could crumble and be remade. The home was a vessel for days, not for eternity. And yet this is where eternity practiced its gentler forms. You step inside, and the air changes. It is cooler, held in the shade of low ceilings and narrow passages. A faint scent rises, clay warmed earlier, stale sweetness from stored grain, the ghost of smoke that once curled along the roof beams. Light enters carefully, as if it has learned respect, slipping through small openings and laying thin stripes across the floor. Room by room you move inward, not through halls of excess, but through spaces shaped by necessity, belief, and the steady mathematics of survival. Here, a corner for storage, jars lined like silent moons, bellies round with barley or emmer, sealed with mud and cloth. There, a place for tools, simple, enduring, handled so often they feel alive. Nothing is decorative for its own sake, even beauty has a job. Where memory fades, the house still holds its choreography. A woven mat is rolled against a wall, a low stool rests in shadow, a clay lamp waits unlit, its wick darkened like a closed eye. The floor bears the softened evidence of many feet, shallow hollows where bodies have stood, knelt, turned, returned. And then the sleeping chamber. It is smaller than you might expect. Not a separate kingdom, but a shared nest. Families gathered here on mats laid side by side, bodies aligned like reeds in a single current. The night was not a time of isolation, it was a time of closeness, of listening to the same darkness together. Above the mats, protective symbols may have been painted or placed, simple marks in ochre and ash, or a small image pressed into plaster. In Egypt, protection was not abstract, it was practical. It was desired with the same urgency as food, because sleep, for the ancient mind, was not merely rest, it was crossing. Whispers tell us that dreams were not treated as accidents of the mind, but as messages drifting through a veil, omens, warnings, sometimes gifts. Surviving texts include manuals for interpreting dreams, like the Ramesside Dream Book, preserved on Papyrus Chester Beatty III, which sorts dream images into good and bad, as if the night itself could be read like a scroll. So the sleeping room becomes more than a place to lie down. It becomes a shoreline. The body rests and something else travels. A dream might arrive like an animal moving through fog. A familiar face might speak without sound. A window might appear where no window exists. The household would wake and carry these night messages gently, the way one carries water, careful not to spill meaning too quickly, careful not to mock what might be sacred. And near the head, sometimes quite literally, protection gathered. Images of household guardians, such as Bess, appear on objects connected to sleep, including headrests, meant to ward off harm in the vulnerable hours. The gods of the home were not remote, enthroned in distant stone. They pressed close to daily life, to childbirth, to illness, to nightmares, to the fragile boundary between breathing and dreaming. This is the deeper mystery. The home was not only shelter, it was a small temple built out of need. Now drift with me toward the kitchen, not a separate room of leisure, but a warm, smoke-softened chamber where nourishment was made with ritual patience. The scent here is different: ash and grain, clay and heat, the faint tang of fermentation. Bread was not a side note in ancient Egypt, it was a foundation. Its making was documented and depicted across time, an everyday art repeated until it became almost cosmic in its certainty. The oven glows like a small sun of its own. Its mouth is dark, its belly alive with heat. Nearby, dough rests, simple, heavy, quietly transforming. Hands would shape it, press it, slide it toward fire, and when it rises and browns, it does so with a kind of sunrise logic, not sudden, not loud, but inevitable.
Listen closely, and you can almost hear it. The soft crackle of fuel, the hush of flour settling, the dull thump of dough placed down, the quiet breath of a home feeding itself. Every corner hums with labor, but the labor is not frantic. It is shared survival, steady, communal, unperformed. This is where the title's dust becomes intimate. Dust is on the floor, yes, but also in the flour that drifts like pale sand. Dust in the ash that clings to the oven's edge. Dust on the jar's shoulder. Dust that gathers in corners like time gathering in the folds of a life. And then, when the day has fully withdrawn, moonlight arrives, not as a spotlight, but as a veil. It slips through the doorway, spills along the floor, and turns the room into something larger than its dimensions. Mud brick walls, so close in daytime, become soft cliffs at night. The low ceiling becomes a sky of shadow. The air cools and settles, and the house begins to feel like a held breath. Marked by the moon, even ordinary objects look ceremonial. A jar becomes a silhouette of ancient patience. A mat becomes a shoreline. A small niche in the wall becomes an altar, even if no offering sits there. And in that quiet transformation, myth slides in gently, without claiming certainty, without forcing belief. A household spirit at the door, an ancestor lingering in familiar shadow,
a protective gaze in the corner where the lamp's glow cannot reach, not because anyone proved it, but because the mind, especially at night, knows that survival has always depended on unseen mercies. Still, uncertainty remains, and it should. How much joy soaked into these walls, how much sorrow, how many arguments ended in silence, how many reconciliations happened without witnesses, how many names were spoken here for the last time. Archaeology can show us materials and layouts, tools and fragments, the logic of domestic building, mudbrick and wood as the standard language of homes. Texts can show us that dreams were interpreted, that protective deities were invoked, that the night carried significance. But the most private currents, the small loves, the quiet fears, do not fossilize easily. Perhaps that is the secret these rooms kept, not a treasure hidden under stone, but the simple truth that a life can be sacred without being recorded. And so the chapter closes the way the house closes, softly. The room is empty now, not because no one ever lived here, but because time has taken back its furniture. The mats are gone, the jars are shattered or buried, the oven is cold, the walls have thinned into ruin and then into earth. Moonlight spills across the floor and illuminates nothing but silence. Yet the silence is not blank. It has texture, it has weight, it has the faint impression of breath. Beneath the silence, the rooms seem to remember more than history allows us to hear. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen.
It is said that the first light a home remembers is not the sun. It is the glow that begins inside clay. Before the sky has fully decided it will be morning, before birds thread sound through the cool air, a small round mouth waits in shadow, an oven made of earth, its lip darkened by smoke, its belly still holding last night's warmth like a secret kept under the tongue. Beneath the silence, the hearth breathes, not wildly, not greedily, patiently. The oven's shape is simple, clay and grit, straw and soot, a dome or cylinder built to withstand the slow insistence of heat. It is not meant to impress, it is meant to endure the daily argument between hunger and time. In ancient Egyptian life, bread was a staple so constant it becomes hard to separate from the idea of living itself. Bread and beer appearing again and again in rations and records, ordinary and essential. And yet, when you kneel beside the hearth in the hour before sunrise, it feels like more than a tool. A question flickers here, like flames seen through half-closed eyes. Was this hearth merely for food, or was it a small echo of creation itself? The fire inside is not a storm, it is an agreement. Fuel is arranged with care, ash is moved aside like bedding, embers are coaxed back to life with small breaths that do not hurry. The heat answers gradually, as if waking. The oven warms from within, and the room around it changes, air turning softer, shadows loosening their grip. Where memory fades, the body remembers this rhythm, the lean toward warmth, the hands in the glow, the face lit from below as if by a private sunrise. And then the dough, grain and water, made patient. In a bowl or on a flat stone, the mixture is worked until it becomes something cohesive, no longer separate elements, but a single quiet mass. The kneading is steady, repetitive, almost trance-like. Press, fold, turn. Press, fold, turn. The motion carries no drama, it carries time. Archaeology and experimental work around Egyptian bread making show the deep variety of techniques and installations, grinding emplacements, bakeries, ovens, and different forms of baking that turn dough into daily certainty. But in the home, in the hush, the details do not present themselves as research. They present themselves as ceremony. Children watch, not because they are being taught in words, but because the body learns by orbiting the center. They learn the smell of grain becoming something else. They learn the sound of dough separating from the hands with a soft sigh. They learn that heat is not only dangerous, it is generous when respected. The hearth feeds bodies, yes, but it also binds the households to the daily logic of the sky. In Egypt, the sun's return was not taken for granted. The sun god's cycle, rising, traveling, setting, then passing through night before returning, was one of the great repeating stories that helped make the world feel held together. Even later funerary traditions describe the sun's night journey through the underworld, a perilous passage that ends in renewal. So when the oven glows in the early morning, it does more than cook. It mirrors. A small sun inside a house answers the great sun outside. Dough becomes bread the way night becomes morning, through transformation, through patience, through the invisible work of time. Some loaves are shaped as rounds, some pressed flatter. Some might be baked in molds or vessels set among hot ash, the heat held close on all sides, like a sealed promise. The oven's mouth darkens and brightens as fire shifts. A faint thread of smoke rises and finds its way upward, searching for the first pale blue of day. And here the deeper layers begin to appear, quietly, without insisting that we know everything. Because in ancient Egypt, the household was not only a place of labor, it was also a place where protection and balance were sought in small, intimate ways, through objects, offerings, images, and habits that made the unseen feel closer. Domestic religion is visible in archaeological traces and studies of household cult practice, especially at sites like Amarna and Deir el-Medina, where niches, images, and small devotional setups suggest private reverence lived alongside official temple worship. So imagine a small portion set aside, not extravagant, not wasteful, a piece, a crumb, a first taste. It might be for an ancestor, those who once stood in this same place, whose hands once kneaded, whose laughter once rose with the smoke. Ancestor veneration was a real feature of Egyptian society, a way of keeping family cohesion and obligation alive across the boundary of death. Or it might be for a household guardian, one of the protective figures whose presence gathered around vulnerable moments, sleep, childbirth, sickness, the liminal hours when the body is open to fear. Bes and Taweret, among others, appear as protective presences in domestic contexts and objects, not because the home believed itself powerful, but because the home knew itself fragile. Whispers tell us that neglecting the hearth could invite imbalance, not only practical imbalance, burned bread, wasted grain, hunger, but a deeper disturbance, the sense that carelessness in the center of the home could ripple outward. In a culture that valued harmony and rightness, small disruptions could feel like cracks where chaos might enter. Whether one names that order Mot
or simply the way things should be, the emotion is the same, a desire to keep the world from slipping. And yet, contradictions surface, as they always do when you look closely at real life. Hunger alongside abundance. A household may have little, and still the oven is honored. The poorest home carries the dignity of flame, not as an aesthetic, but as refusal to surrender. The hearth is where scarcity is negotiated daily. The same hands that know ritual also know anxiety. The same oven that bakes offerings also bakes survival. Bread is both sacred and bluntly practical. It fills the belly. It steadies the day. It becomes ration, gift, payment, comfort. At large work sites, bread and beer rations are attested as staple provisions, evidence of how foundational these foods were across social levels. So the hearth is never only symbolic. It is a real heat that must be fed. It consumes fuel. It requires tending. It punishes distraction. It rewards attention. And this is where the title's strange tenderness becomes clear. The hearth fed the sun not by claiming divinity, but by practicing devotion through repetition. Each morning, the family participates, quietly, in the world's renewal. Each loaf is a small rebirth the body can hold. Each ember is an echo of the larger fire that rises beyond the walls. Now the day passes. The oven works. The household moves around it. The air fills and empties of smoke. The floor gathers flour dust like pale desert wind. Crumbs scatter, then are swept away. An endless cycle of making and unmaking, like the river depositing silt and then pulling it back. Evening comes gently.
The fire is smaller now, less eager. The oven's warmth retreats inward. The last bread is stored, shared, or finished. The room cools. Shadows thicken at the base of the walls, and the final reflection softens into embers. Night settles without announcement. The household quiets. The oven cools slowly, like an animal folding itself into sleep. Smoke drifts upward in a faint, thinning ribbon, as if carrying whispered gratitude toward the darkening sky. Outside, the stars appear, star-marked, ancient, indifferent and intimate all at once. Inside, a last glow remains, touching soot-blackened clay and the edge of a bowl, then fading. The listener is left with a warmth that feels older than explanation, the sense that every loaf once held a fragment of the sun's promise. Perhaps it was never meant to be proved, only repeated. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. It is said that a doorway is a kind of sentence the house speaks to the world. Low, worn, sacred. Before morning heat climbs the walls, before the street fully wakes, there is a child at that doorway, barefoot on packed earth, toes dusted pale as flour. The child stands where two kinds of air meet. Inside, coolness, clay shade, the stored smell of bread and smoke. Outside, the sun's first sharpness, the faint grit of wind, the murmurs of a village beginning again, half in shadow, half in light. And the question rises as softly as breath. What did it mean to grow within walls that believed in eternity? Not eternity as a distant paradise only, but eternity as a daily posture, names preserved, order tended, the sun expected to return, the dead not fully gone so long as they were remembered. Even when homes were built of mudbrick, materials meant for living and remaking, not for lasting forever, the ideas inside those homes could be stubbornly enduring. Beneath the silence, childhood begins as a passage. This chapter follows that quiet world, often overlooked because the grand monuments do not easily record small hands. Yet evidence leaks through in fragments: a toy ball stitched from linen, a rattle that once held pebbles, tiny amulets worn against a small chest, a name written carefully as if it mattered more than the body that carried it. The child steps back inside. The home is close-walled, low-ceilinged, practical in its bones. Light enters in thin, deliberate strips. The floor remembers movement, faint hollows where feet have turned, where kneeling has happened, where a mat has been unrolled and rolled again. In one corner, a cluster of jars rounds its shoulders in the shade. In another, a niche rests in the wall like a held breath, empty now, but once perhaps a place for a small image, a protective sign, an offering that was not grand enough for history to praise and not small enough for the family to neglect. Studies of household religion show how domestic spaces could host private devotion alongside temple worship, quiet practices aimed at protection and balance. And then play. Not loud, not staged, but woven through the day like thread. A game traced in dust with a fingertip. A line becomes a river. A circle becomes a sun. A few stones become players in a board game imagined without a board. The child's world is built from what is near: clay, reed, wood, scraps, materials that also built the house, also fed the ovens, also filled the baskets. Archaeological collections preserve this ordinary creativity. The British Museum holds small toy balls made of linen and reed, objects whose softness suggests hands that threw them, chased them, laughed over them. But here is a necessary correction to the romantic picture. Not everything that looks like a doll was a toy. The Met's notes on paddle dolls, for instance, emphasize that these figures were likely ritual objects, not children's playthings, reminding us how easily modern eyes mislabel what they want to be true. So the chapter keeps its voice gentle and its claims careful. Children played, yes, but children also orbited the adult world of work and belief, absorbing it without being told that they were learning. Education in pharaonic Egypt was not universal. Formal scribal training belonged mostly to a narrower slice of society, while much learning happened at home, skills passed down by watching, helping, repeating. A scholarly overview of education in pharaonic Egypt describes early home instruction shaped by family roles and ethical ideals, before any specialized schooling for some boys. This kind of learning has a different tempo. It is slow. It is bodily. A child learns how to carry water without spilling it, how to sweep dust into a corner without raising it into the lungs, how to watch a flame without trusting it, how to wait while dough becomes bread, how to lower the voice when the day begins to dim. And language enters too, as ritual does, through the name. Names are not neutral here. Names are chosen as if they could lift weight off the future. Many Egyptian names are theophoric, bearing the presence of a deity within them, like a small tether to protection, favor, order. A name can be a hope spoken aloud each time the child is called. And more than that, in Egyptian thought,
The wren, the name, was bound to identity and survival in memory. The British Museum's public explanation of soul concepts includes the wren as a vital component, underscoring why names were treated with such seriousness. So when a child stands at the threshold, it is not only a body standing there, it is a name stepping into light. Now the spiritual layers unfold, quietly, like smoke that doesn't announce itself. Whispers tell us that children were closer to the unseen. Not because they had special powers in a modern fantasy sense, but because they lived nearer to the edges, nearer to birth, nearer to illness, nearer to accident, nearer to whatever the family feared might slip in through cracks: scorpions, fevers, bad luck, envy, night terrors. A museum exhibition on childhood in Egypt focused on later periods, but drawing on long-lived practices, notes the vulnerability of early life and the enduring use of protective strategies. So amulets appear, small, weightless-seeming things that carry heavy hopes. Bes and Tawaret, for example, are repeatedly linked to safeguarding mothers and children. Tawaret amulets, in particular, are described in museum contexts as protective objects used by pregnant and nursing women for defense against harmful forces. Imagine the feel of one against a child's chest, cool faience, warmed slowly by skin. Not magic as spectacle, magic as reassurance. At the doorway at night, a parent may glance at that amulet before sleep, not because logic demands it, but because love demands something to hold on to. Yet sorrow is never far. That is the part many cozy versions of history try to blur, and it's a blind spot worth resisting. Infant mortality in ancient societies, including Egypt, was high. Scholarship and bibliographic records around Gay Robin's well-known article on pregnancy, birth, and infant mortality point to the reality that families often carried both joy and the expectation of loss in the same steady breath. That changes the tone of everything. A laugh is more precious because it is not guaranteed. A first step across a threshold is not merely cute, it is a victory against a statistical darkness the family may not phrase in numbers, but feels in stories, in neighbors' silences, in tiny graves, in names that stop being spoken. So childhood becomes an art of holding opposites: play and fear, tenderness and vigilance, ordinary days and the constant undertone of "please let this one stay." As the day turns, the child moves through rooms like a small comet through a private sky. The kitchen smells of grain and smoke. The sleeping space holds woven mats and shadows. The courtyard, if there is one, breathes out heat into evening. The doorway keeps doing what it does: separating, inviting, warning, blessing. And then twilight. The sun lowers its voice. The air cools. A call comes, soft, familiar, summoning the child indoors. The child hesitates a moment, not wanting the game to end, not wanting the light to change. But the threshold darkens, and that darkness is not only literal, because the threshold marks passage not only between house and street, but between innocence and memory, between the world that is pure present and the world that begins to store images, carry absences, recognize what can be lost. The child steps inside. The doorway remains, low, worn, sacred. A strip of moonlight slides across the floor, as if the sky is quietly reading the room. Dust glints like small stars and then settles again. The house listens. The street hushes. The night gathers its veils. And the listener is left with a tender ache, the sense of fleeting light preserved only in story, names spoken softly so they do not disappear, laughter remembered because the walls could not keep it, thresholds honored because so much depends on crossing them safely. Perhaps it was never meant to be held forever, only held long enough. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen.
It is said that a house is not truly built when the last brick is laid. A house is built again each morning. Before the city stirs, before the first shouting vendor unrolls his voice into the street, there is a hush that belongs only to interior spaces. In that hush, the home is cool and dim, smelling faintly of clay and last night's smoke. A thin seam of light slides across the floor like water searching for a channel. And within that quiet, women move. Not as a spectacle, not as an announcement. They move the way tides move, certain, returning, shaping everything by repetition. A jar is shifted into shade, ash is gathered and carried away. A mat is shaken until dust becomes air and then becomes nothing again. In a house made of mudbrick, built for living, not for eternity, the work of maintenance is a kind of daily architecture, the slow refusal to let the walls become only dust. A quiet question rises with the first warmth of day. Who truly kept the Egyptian home alive? The answer is not carved on temple pylons. It is not sung in royal lists. It is held in small actions that rarely survive, except as echoes. Grinding stones worn smooth, soot-darkened corners, the pattern of storage jars, the domestic niche where protection was asked for in a voice too low for outsiders to hear. Beneath the silence, the unseen architecture begins. Food first, not as a lifestyle, but as a foundation. Grain is measured, water is fetched. The day's bread is imagined before it exists. Bread and beer were staples across Egyptian society, and provisioning records show how central these foods were to daily life. But in the home, bread is not a staple. It is a ritual of steadiness. Dough is kneaded with patience, pressed and folded until it becomes coherent, like a household becoming coherent. The oven waits in its corner, clay-bodied and soot-ringed, absorbing heat the way the walls absorb sun. The rhythm is slow enough to be calming, repetitive enough to feel like prayer without words. Children learn without being taught. They learn by orbiting, by watching how hands move, by noticing that the flame is respected, by hearing the hush that falls over a room when something sacred and dangerous is being tended at once.
And then there are the other threads: water, sweeping, storage, repairs, care for the sick, care for the small, care for the old. Wives, mothers, daughters, and servants form a living web, some with authority, some with obligation, each strand essential to the whole holding. It matters, too, that this holding was not only physical. As layers deepen, the home becomes a stage of power that does not always look like power. Ancient Egyptian women, compared with many other ancient societies, could hold significant legal rights, Accessible summaries from the Egypt Exploration Society note that women could buy and inherit property, represent themselves in court, and own businesses. So the household's order was not necessarily maintained by someone who was legally invisible. A woman could own property in her own name, make dispositions, and act within legal frameworks that recognized her capacity. That doesn't erase the daily burdens, it doesn't turn the home into a utopia, but it complicates the lazy story that domestic life equals powerlessness. If you're tempted to treat the women of the house as purely hidden, you're flattening them, turning lived complexity into a single mood. This is where the chapter needs honesty. Freedom beside burden, reverence beside exhaustion. To hold the walls together is to be relied upon. Reliance can be a kind of honor and also a kind of trap. Now, the chapter turns toward cosmetics, not as vanity, but as protection. A small vessel is opened. Oil catches the light like a thin, golden skin. Scent rises. Resin, herbs, something sharp and clean. Coal is prepared. Dark pigment ground fine, mixed carefully. In Egypt, eye paint carried meanings beyond fashion, protective, medicinal, magical, practical against glare and dust. So the act of lining the eye can be read like a veil against chaos, not a mask to impress the world, but a boundary drawn at the edge of sight. May harm stay away, may the body hold, may the day pass without misfortune. This isn't just poetic license. Sources discussing coal's significance emphasize its associations with health and protection, including enduring beliefs about guarding against the evil eye, as well as practical benefits in harsh environments. In the home, protection is rarely loud, it is layered. A household shrine or niche might hold small objects of devotion. Domestic religion research points to private, household-level worship and veneration practices that continued alongside official cults, preserved through small objects, amulets, and quiet rituals.
Offerings can be tiny: bread crust, a pour of water, a pinch of incense, and memory is tended the way the oven is tended, not once, but repeatedly. Ancestors are not only the past, they are part of the household's moral architecture, what you owe, what you inherit, what you must not forget. Scholarship on ancestor veneration in Egypt shows it as a real feature of religious life, especially in domestic and community contexts. So a woman's work includes remembering who died last inundation season, remembering which child survived fever, remembering which neighbor helped when grain ran low, remembering the right words for the right moment, and the quiet restraint to say nothing when words would make the home tilt off balance. If you want a single image of power here, don't reach for crowns. Reach for keys. Keys of storage, keys of timing, keys of ritual, keys of social glue. Because the home is a system, and systems have operators. Still, contradictions breathe quietly. Legal rights can coexist with social expectation. Property ownership can coexist with fatigue. Spiritual authority can coexist with endless chores. The dignity of flame can coexist with hunger. If you're trying to find a clean moral, they were empowered or they were oppressed, you're missing what's actually interesting: the constant negotiation between what society allows, what family demands, and what the body can sustain. And then, nightfall. The day's heat loosens, the walls exhale, lamps are lit, their flames small and steady, making shadows gather behind jars and stools like quiet animals. The house settles into itself, the way sand settles after a footstep. A woman pauses.
Not as a cinematic pose, but as a real pause. A moment when the body checks the home the way a hand checks a child's forehead, listening for what might be wrong, feeling for what might be missing, sensing whether the night will be gentle. In that pause, the listener can feel the strength of hands that shaped generations, hands that measured grain, hands that soothed fear, hands that drew protective lines around sight, hands that kept maims alive, hands that repaired, swept, stored, offered, remembered. Now those hands are returned to dust, but the structure they made, order, rhythm, continuity, still holds the walls together through memory. Perhaps it was never meant to be credited, only endured. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen.
It is said that dusk is when the house begins to speak in softer languages. The light lowers itself. The courtyard, if there is one, releases the day's warmth like a long-held sigh. Inside, shadows gather at the base of walls, and even ordinary objects seem to lean closer together. Jars, baskets, low stools, forming a quiet congregation. And there, at the center of this hush, a low table is set. Not high, not proud, not built for display. A table close to the earth, as if the meal is meant to be shared with the ground itself. Bread is placed first, rounded loaves, simple, heavy with grain. Then beer in a jar, its clay shoulder cool to the touch. Vegetables, perhaps, and fruit when season allows, green and gold against the sand-colored room. Everything arranged with care. And so the question arrives, not like thunder, but like a candle catching. Who else, unseen, was invited to these meals? Beneath the silence, the chapter opens not on consumption, but on communion. In ancient Egypt, food was daily life, and food was also relationship, between family members, between living and dead, between humans and gods. Bread and beer especially were foundational staples of the diet and appear repeatedly in contexts that blur meal and offering. The Met's overview of Middle Kingdom food culture foregrounds bread and beer as staples and notes how rations could function like payment, binding food to the structure of society itself. But the home does not speak in economic terms. The home speaks in gestures. Hands break bread slowly. A piece is passed. A cup is offered and received. The pace is not hurried, because hunger is not the only thing being fed. Silence is allowed to sit at the edge of the table without being chased away. The meal becomes a small ritual of order. Everyone gathered, everyone placed, the world briefly made coherent. Then, quietly, a portion is set aside, not always announced, not necessarily large, a fragment of bread, a pour of beer, a piece of fruit placed where the light is dimmer, nearer to a niche, nearer to a corner that feels different than the others. This is not extravagance, it is the opposite, a controlled generosity, a disciplined acknowledgement that the household is not alone in its story.
Egyptian offering practices are well attested in temple and funerary contexts. Food and drink presented to deities and the deceased, sustaining them in a religious logic of reciprocity. Even when we focus on domestic life, the same mental architecture lingers, a sense that nourishment can move across thresholds if arranged properly and remembered faithfully.
So eating becomes a bridge between worlds, yes, but also between times, because the dead were not simply gone, they were remembered into presence. Ancestor veneration is documented as part of Egyptian religious life, shaping how families understood obligation and continuity. The household meal, repeated over seasons, becomes a reliable point of contact, a place where memory can return without needing to knock. Whispers tell us the dead could visit, not necessarily as bodies, not necessarily as visions, but as a nearness, carried by scent, by the warmth of bread, by the first pour of beer, by the way a living person pauses before eating, as if allowing someone else to begin. This is where modern assumptions can mislead you. You might want the invisible to be theatrical, ghosts, apparitions, certainty, but what the evidence suggests is subtler and, frankly, more believable. Points of contact shaped by material culture, niches, offering setups, small rituals, and by a social psychology that treats remembrance as active. Domestic religion scholarship discusses household cult practice and the ways homes could contain transition zones or contact points, spaces that echo funerary ideas of communication with the ka, the vital essence that needed sustenance and recognition. So the table at dusk is not only a table, it is a threshold. The meal might include what most people could afford: vegetables, onions, legumes, bread, beer, meat rarer for many households. A modern synthesis like World History Encyclopedia describes the diet as bread, beer, vegetable-centered, with meat less common. But the emotional logic matters more than the menu, the act of sharing, and the act of setting aside. Now the chapter deepens, and myth and daily life begin to merge without forcing a lecture. Imagine the air above the bread, warm, grain-scented, carrying the faint smoke from the oven earlier in the day. In temple rituals, offerings were presented to deities, and after the formal presentation, the food could be redistributed, offering as a cycle, not a disappearance. In the home, the mechanism is not bureaucratic, but the feeling is similar. Nothing is wasted, yet something is given. The invisible is sustained not by chewing, but by essence, by scent, by attention, by words spoken under the breath. And if that feels too abstract, notice how humans already behave. People still cook the way Grandma did. People still set out a place at the table on anniversaries. People still feel a presence in familiar rooms. You don't need supernatural certainty for this. You need continuity and love and a mind that refuses to treat the past as sealed.
Contradictions emerge quietly because real households contain them. Scarcity alongside generosity. A family may be measuring grain carefully, aware of the next inundation, the next ration, the next illness, and still a portion is set aside. This is not irrational, it is risk management of a different kind, an investment in protection, in order, in being the sort of household that honors what must be honored. Fear alongside trust. If unseen forces exist, they can be feared. If ancestors linger, they can judge. If gods watch, they can withhold.
But the meal suggests trust, too, the belief that reciprocity is possible, that the household can be held in balance if it behaves with care. And the gestures stay slow, bread broken, cup passed, a pause before the first bite. Because if the invisible is present, you don't rush, you acknowledge, you make space. The room's textures begin to speak. The coolness of clay walls after sunset, the matte surface of a pottery bowl worn by years of washing, the tiny crumbs on the table's edge like grains of time, the hush in the corners where oil lamps wait. The meal ends not with a finale, but with drifting. Someone gathers bowls, someone wipes the table, someone pours a last sip of beer into the dust near the threshold, libation as a small, disappearing gift. The offering portion may remain a little longer, allowed to sit, as if the household is giving the invisible enough time to arrive. Then the lamp is lit. Its flame is modest, and that modesty is the point. It does not conquer the dark, it negotiates with it. Smoke curls upward in a thin ribbon, searching for the roof opening, searching for the night air, searching for the stars. And the chapter's final reflection fades into that smoke, because smoke is the perfect symbol for a meal shared with the invisible, proof of fire, evidence of warmth, and yet impossible to grasp. It rises, thins, dissolves, carrying scent, carrying the last whisper of bread, carrying gratitude or worry or both. Night settles. The table is quieter now, but not empty in meaning. The room holds a faint sweetness, a trace of beer, a memory of hands. Outside, the sky opens its dark cloth and sets down stars one by one, as if the heavens are also laying a table. Perhaps no one ever truly ate alone. Perhaps it was never meant to be witnessed directly, only felt, in the way a house grows still after dinner, in the way memory sits down beside us when the day grows dim. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen.
It is said that night does not fall in Egypt. It descends, softly like a veil lowered over a lamp, like river mist choosing the earth, like a hand placed gently over a child's eyes. And with it comes a whispered question, the kind that only visits when the last voices thin and the house begins to breathe in a slower rhythm. How did Egyptians surrender to sleep, knowing dreams could open gates? The sleeping chamber waits in the dim. It is not a spacious sanctuary built for comfort alone. It is close-walled, low-ceilinged, shaped by necessity. The air carries a faint trace of soot, a sweet dryness of stored grain, the quiet mineral smell of mudbrick cooling after day heat. A woven mat lies rolled against the wall like a coiled shoreline. Nearby, a wooden headrest, curved and firm, rests where it always rests, a strange pillow to modern eyes, yet familiar to centuries of sleepers who trusted its shape to cradle the skull and keep the body lifted from heat and insects. But in Egypt, nothing that touches sleep is only practical. Beneath the silence, protection begins to gather, layer by layer, like cloth over a flame. A door is checked, then checked again. A latch is set, not because the household expects attack every night, but because the night is honest. It admits vulnerability. Human threats exist, yes, but so do the unseen ones. Fevers, bites, nightmares, the sudden coldness of breath when the mind slides into places it cannot map.
So the home prepares as if sleep were a journey. A lamp is lit, modest and steady, its glow warming the corner of the room without challenging the dark. Shadows collect behind jars and stools like quiet animals. The flame's smoke rises in a thin ribbon, then disappears near the ceiling beams, as if the house is exhaling a last thought before surrender. In that light, the walls do what walls always do. They keep the world out. And yet, the Egyptians knew that sleep is not the same as safety. Sleep is not escape. It is voyage. The body remains, the mind loosens its rope.
And dreams. Dreams were not treated as random theater. They could be messages, warnings, blessings. In the Ramesside period, a dream manual survives, Papyrus Chester Beatty III, organized in the calm, uncompromising format of divination. If a man sees himself in a dream, followed by judgment and meaning, the night was considered readable, like a scroll laid out in the dark. So imagine a household settling down with that knowledge in its bones, a mat unrolled, a headrest set, a final sip of water, a pause. The gestures are slow, as if speed might offend whatever listens. A hand touches an amulet, small, cool, worn smooth from repetition. The object itself may be faience, stone, or carved wood, not large enough to impress, only large enough to carry hope. Protection deities like Bes and Taweret are closely associated with guarding the vulnerable, especially children, mothers, and sleepers, and they appear on objects tied to the night. Even headrests could bear protective imagery, as if the very support of the skull needed divine reinforcement. This is the heart of it. Sleep is a state where the self is open, so Egyptians layered defenses, not loud defenses, intimate ones, a boundary at the door, a protective figure near the head, a whispered line of prayer, a small offering left in a niche, a name remembered aloud, because remembering is also a kind of guard. Where memory fades, danger grows. That is the logic that turns bedtime into ritual. The chapter drifts deeper, not into spectacle, but into the way belief saturates ordinary acts. The lamp's light flickers, the room settles, the outside world is quieter now, distant water sounds, an occasional animal call, the city's last mutter fading into nothing. Through a narrow opening, perhaps a small window, perhaps a gap near the roofline, the stars become visible. Not many, just enough, sharp points pinned into deep cloth. Stars were not merely decoration in the Egyptian sky. They were part of the architecture of the cosmos, markers of time, travelers, witnesses, and so the sleeping chamber becomes a small model of the world, earth walls holding an interior, a narrow view to the heavens, and the human body placed between. Marked by the moon, even fear changes texture. In daylight, fear can be argued with. At night, it becomes quieter and more persuasive. It arrives as doubt, as sudden images, as the feeling of being watched, sometimes by real eyes, sometimes by the mind's own ancient habits. So the household does not pretend fear isn't there. It meets fear with form. Touch amulet, check door, lower voice, breathe slower. If a nightmare comes, it is not brushed aside as only a dream. It is considered, not necessarily obeyed, but respected as a possible signal. The dream manual tradition itself implies a culture that treated dream content as meaningful enough to classify and interpret.
But here is a blind spot to avoid. Don't turn Egyptian dream belief into a single, neat system where everyone behaved the same way. Some people would have been more skeptical, others more devout, others too exhausted to do anything but collapse onto a mat. Belief is never uniform in any society. It's messy, practiced unevenly, shaped by class, education, personal loss, and sheer fatigue. That messiness is where the truth lives. Rest beside vigilance, trust beside fear. A mother might want to believe the amulet is enough. She might also know from experience that illness can take a child even in a well-tended home. A worker might want to trust the night. He might have also seen too much, too many fevers, too many accidents, to treat sleep as harmless. So bedtime becomes a compromise. You surrender, but you do not surrender thoughtlessly. Even the headrest participates in this tension. Firm, elevated, it keeps the head lifted, cooler, cleaner, safer from crawling things. Yet it is also symbolic. The head is precious, the seat of identity and breath, the part that must be guarded in both life and death. Museums and collections emphasize headrests not just as household objects, but as items linked to protection during sleep. So the sleeper lays down with the head supported, as if placing the mind on a pedestal, asking it to travel and return intact. The lamp dims. The room's sounds simplify.
Breath becomes the loudest thing. Inhale, exhale, like waves against a clay shore. Outside, the night stretches. Inside, the household loosens into darkness. The last thoughts thin, the last worries become less articulate. The amulet is still there, pressed close, warming slowly against skin, or resting near the headrest, near the place where dreams will enter. And then the voyage begins. A gate opens, but not the kind made of wood, a gate made of images. A river appears where no river is. A voice speaks without mouth. A stairway climbs into a place that cannot exist in daylight. The dream does not ask permission. It arrives the way weather arrives, from beyond the walls. If it is kind, it leaves a sweetness in the morning. If it is frightening, it leaves a residue that clings like smoke. Yet even that residue becomes part of the household's order, a story told softly, a warning noted, a prayer repeated, a small adjustment made, more careful at doors, more attentive to omens, more grateful when the next night passes gently. The chapter's ending does not offer certainty. It offers a sensation, the sensation of being held. Because the title is not promising that gods physically hovered over every mat like visible birds. It is describing how it felt to live inside a world where protection could be requested and imagined, where the night was not empty, and where sleep, dangerous and necessary, could be entered with reverence instead of panic. Now the room is fully dark. Only the faintest glow remains at the lamp's core, like a final ember in clay. The stars watch through the narrow opening, distant, steady, indifferent, and somehow comforting. The house's breath is slow. The walls are still. The door is set. The amulet rests. And the listener drifts with them, not into answers, but into rhythm,
perhaps it was never meant to be explained, only practiced. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen.
It is said that some doors never close, they simply lose their hands. The opening image is ruin, a doorway without a door, a room without a roof, a patch of sky where a ceiling once held smoke and lullabies and ordinary arguments. The walls are collapsed in places, their mud brick bodies broken into soft-edged chunks. Wind has entered like a patient tenant. Sand has moved in without asking. A house stands open to the heavens, not as an invitation, but as a consequence. Beneath the silence, the home is still here, not intact, not proud, but present. You step carefully, as if the ground might remember weight. The floor is layered with dust, so fine it looks like flour. The corners have gathered it the way corners always do, even in living houses. A faint ridge along the base of a wall suggests where sweeping once pushed debris into a neat line. In the place where a roof beam would have rested, you see a shadow of darker clay, like an old bruise. This is what remains when families fade, and the question does not need to be spoken aloud. If the people are gone, why does the house still feel occupied? In ancient Egypt, most domestic architecture was made of mud brick rather than stone. Mud brick was abundant, practical, and thermally useful, but also susceptible to deterioration and collapse over time without maintenance. The commonness of mud brick domestic building is well established in archaeological scholarship, and the vulnerability of earthen architecture to decay is exactly why ruin becomes such a natural ending for many homes. So the narrative walks through abandoned homes with an honest premise. Dust does not only cover, dust interprets. The house becomes a witness, not because it has a mind, but because it retains traces in stubborn materials. Here is a wall fragment where straw once bound clay together. Here is a fallen brick whose surface has a smoothed patch, as if a palm pressed it while it was still wet. You cannot name the hand, you can only feel its brief pressure across thousands of years. Where memory fades, material persists in small, humiliating truths.
A hearth corner is recognizable even when everything else blurs. Soot stains remain darker than the surrounding plaster, a residue of repeated fire. A domestic space is often legible by its stains and wear patterns, even when furniture is long gone. Think of how quickly a home acquires habits in its surfaces. A threshold polished by feet, a corner darkened by lamp smoke, a niche made sacred by repetition. At sites like Deir el Medina, archaeologists have documented standardized house plans and interior installations, including mud brick platforms and niches that may have served ritual or domestic functions. Even when such places were later abandoned, the architecture retains the outline of daily life, the sequence of rooms, the cramped corridors, the locations where people paused and gathered. Now imagine the same plan after silence has moved in. The entrance room is open to the sky. Light spills in too easily, no longer filtered by a door. The main room's platform sits like a low altar that nobody tends. A kitchen zone is only a hint now, a blackened patch, a scatter of ash turned pale, the suggestion of where the oven's mouth faced.
Infill sediments layer the interior, building up in alternating textures as wind and collapse deposit material over time. Geoarchaeological models of mudbrick house degradation describe precisely this kind of process: collapse inward and outward, sediments layering inside and around walls, the house gradually becoming a small landscape. So the home is not simply destroyed, it is rewritten. And the rewriting has its own slow rhythm, like a ritual performed by weather. A brick falls, a season passes, fine sand drifts in and settles. Another section collapses, carrying roof debris down into the room like a quiet avalanche. The house becomes an archive made of layers, each layer a sentence the wind adds. Then the story deepens. Offerings. In a living home, a small niche can hold objects of devotion, protection, and remembrance. Research into personal religion in domestic contexts emphasizes continuity in household-level devotional practice and the use of domestic spaces for ritual acts, especially in the New Kingdom and beyond. A niche might be painted, framed, and treated as a contact point between the household and what it trusts. Now in ruin, what happens to that sacred corner? Sometimes nothing remains but the shape. Sometimes a small fragment persists, an offering dish shard, a smear of pigment, a shallow depression where an object sat repeatedly. Even if the object is gone, the habit is still visible. This is the house's strange power. It holds patterns longer than flesh can endure.
You notice a jar stand, broken but still placed where storage once made sense. You notice how the strongest wall remnants cluster around corners, like elbows that resisted collapse. You notice how the most sheltered spaces kept the finest dust, untouched by rain. And you begin to suspect something uncomfortable. The home did not only host a family, it trained the family. It shaped their movement. It taught them where to slow down, where to gather, where to store, where to pray. So when the people vanish, the training remains in the layout. The house outlived its builders because it outlived their habits. Whispers tell us that a house is never empty in the way a field is empty. A field returns to wildness. A house returns to echo. Even in complete abandonment, the structure continues to do what it was designed to do: create interior space, frame light, collect air, define thresholds. It still instructs the body how to move, even if no one moves there now. But here is where you must resist a convenient fantasy. It's tempting to say the house remembers like a person. That makes a pleasing ending. Yet the more interesting truth is harsher and deeper. The house preserves traces without caring about them. The witness is indifferent. The archive is accidental. And that indifference is what makes it sacred, because it means the house will keep what it keeps, whether or not anyone is watching. It will store soot. It will store fingerprints. It will store collapse layers. It will store the geometry of a life, even when the names are lost. If you need a parallel, archaeologists studying settlement formation and abandonment routinely show that houses degrade in patterned ways, leaving readable deposits and collapse signatures. The ruin is not random. It is a slow physics of mudbrick, gravity, and wind. And yet you stand in the middle of it, and it still feels like a story. Because humans cannot help it, we read rooms the way we read faces. We assign meaning to thresholds. We sense absence as presence.
Where memory fades, imagination steps in and tries to be respectful. You do not see the family, you see their tracework. A soot-dark ceiling remnant suggests where lamp smoke rose night after night. A doorway's worn base suggests countless crossings. A niche suggests a habit of offering, a habit of asking, a habit of hoping. Domestic niches and ancestor-related practices have been discussed in context of settlements like Amarna and Deir el-Medina, where such architectural features recur. And then the closing image arrives, moonlight. It does not illuminate answers, it illuminates surfaces. Moonlight touches broken stone and fallen brick. It outlines the edges of a room that no longer contains its roof. It turns dust into a soft silver ocean. The wind moves through the open space with the ease of something that has won. The listener is left with sacred uncertainty. Did the house ever truly empty? Or does it still hold the builders in a different way, through soot, through wear, through small architectural decisions that still shape the air? Perhaps it was never meant to be preserved perfectly, only long enough for someone, someday, to feel the echo. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen.
It is said that you can hear a festival before you can see it. First, as a tremor in the air, music carried on distance, softened by walls, made mysterious by corners. Then, as a scent, incense and crushed flowers, the warm breath of beer jars opened too early. And only later, as color, petals and woven garlands, torchlight touching clay and plaster and making the ordinary glow. A question stirs with that far-off rhythm. How did celebration cross the threshold? The chapter opens on a festival evening when the street becomes a moving river and the house becomes a shoreline. Outside, the sound is layered. A rattle of percussion, a rise and fall of voices, the hush that comes when something sacred is passing. You do not need to name the festival to feel the pattern. Ancient Egypt's calendar held many celebrations, often involving processions, music, incense, offerings, and communal joy. Inside, the house is still a house, mudbrick, close-walled, familiar. Yet the air changes as if it senses what is approaching. The doorway, low and worn, waits like a mouth that might speak. Then the first traces arrive. Not crowds, not chaos, just the edge of it. A few petals tracked across the threshold, dust disturbed in a new pattern, a faint smudge of perfume on the air. A garland appears, looped across a beam, draped along a wall, hung where the family can see it from the mat where they sleep. The house does not resist, it receives. The festival enters the way evening enters, quietly at first, then everywhere. Beneath the silence, the house begins to transform. A courtyard, if the house has one, becomes the center of this metamorphosis. It is open to sky, sheltered by walls, and perfectly suited to hold both domestic life and sudden holiness. In the courtyard, light and shadow can be staged by nothing more than a lamp. Sound can collect and soften. Scent can linger. Food multiplies, not magically, but socially. What would be a simple meal on an ordinary night becomes something more generous because festivals ask for abundance, even when abundance is difficult. Bread is stacked higher, beer is poured more freely, vegetables and fruit are gathered, cut, and arranged. The table becomes a small landscape of offerings. And here, the title shows its deeper meaning. The festival doesn't only enter as party, it enters as ritual. In Egypt, Offerings of bread, beer, and food are central in religious practice, and imagery of feasting and celebration often includes garlands, lotus flowers, drink, and music, symbols that blur pleasure and piety. The British Museum's Feast for Nebamoon materials emphasize garlands and lotus scenting in banquet scenes, showing how celebration was visualized as both sensual and meaningful. So a home, on a festival evening, becomes a miniature echo of larger ceremonies, not a copy, an echo. A corner niche might receive a small portion set aside. A cup might be poured and left for a while before anyone drinks, not because the household is trying to imitate a temple precisely, but because reverence has a familiar grammar: set apart, arrange, offer, wait. Gods are welcomed inside through song and scent. Sometimes that welcome is literal in public processions, statues carried, incense burned, music performed. Festivals like Opet in Thebes were marked by processions and jubilation, described in many modern summaries as involving music, incense, and crowds. But what matters here is the domestic ripple. When the public sacred becomes close enough to be smelled from a doorway, the home reacts. It does what it always does. It makes space. Even if no statue enters this particular house, the feeling of presence does. The family adjusts the room as if honored guests might arrive. Garlands become borders, soft lines that mark the air as different tonight. Flower collars and lotus imagery in Egyptian art often signals celebration and renewal, and even without showing people, the objects themselves can suggest that mood. A lamp is lit earlier than usual, and its flame steadies the courtyard like a small sun pinned low to earth. The walls catch the light and warm in color, sand beige to copper, clay red to deep bronze. Shadows become long and ceremonial, and laughter arrives, not as a roar, as a release. It echoes against mudbrick, and the echo itself feels like a blessing, proof that the house is not only a container for labor and sleep, it can also hold joy without falling apart. This is the quiet mystery. Celebration changes architecture without changing bricks. Ordinary space becomes sacred chamber. A familiar stool becomes a seat of honor. A mat becomes a gathering place. A jar becomes a vessel, not only of beer, but of permission. Permission to loosen the day's discipline. Permission to be glad without apology. As the night deepens, the chapter lingers on small gestures rather than spectacle. Hands break bread slowly. Cups are passed with care, because even in joy there is etiquette. The pace is not rushed. The point is not consumption, but communion. People aligning themselves with each other and with the larger rhythm the festival represents. And above it all, the sky watches. Stars appear one by one, and the courtyard, open to them, feels like a quiet altar. Festivals in Egypt were tied to time, seasons, inundation, divine cycles, anniversaries of myths. The home on such a night becomes a clock made of breath and light. It participates in the calendar not by reading dates, but by feeling the shift. Now the contradictions soften into something almost tender. Order beside chaos. A festival brings disorder, extra mess, louder voices, less sleep. Yet the disorder has a shape, bounded by ritual, contained by walls, guided by the shared understanding that joy must not become harm. Reverence beside joy. The household can laugh and still set aside an offering. It can sing and still lower its voice when incense is lit. It can celebrate and still sense that something unseen is near. If you're tempted to reduce this to a simple idea, religion was strict, or they just liked parties, you miss the texture. In Egyptian thought, pleasure could be part of the gods' gifts, and celebration could be a way of restoring balance, not merely breaking it. Hathor's associations with music, dance, garlands, and festival joy are often noted in general references, even if the details vary by period and source. So the home holds both impulses at once, loosen and contain. The music outside begins to drift farther away, like a boat moving downriver. The street noise thins. The last bright burst of the evening passes, and what remains is residue. Petals on the floor, the sweet heaviness of perfume in the air, a faint stickiness of spilled beer that will be cleaned tomorrow. The festival has entered, and now it begins to leave, slowly, respectfully, like a guest who knows how to go. The chapter ends at that point when sound becomes memory.
A lamp still burns. The garland still hangs, but it has begun to droop, its freshness already moving toward decay. The table has fewer loaves now. A cup sits overturned, empty. In a corner, incense smoke curls upward, thinner and thinner, until it becomes indistinguishable from darkness. Beneath the silence, the house settles. Not back into plainness exactly. Something lingers, warmth in the air, a softened mood, a sense that the walls have been touched by more than routine. Moonlight enters quietly and finds the petals on the floor. It turns them pale, almost ghostly, like small relics of joy. And the listener is left in that hush, suspended between celebration and sleep, feeling the strange intimacy of a world where the sacred could travel by sound and scent, where a courtyard could become a temple for a night, and where the home, so ordinary by day, could briefly hold the gods without breaking. Perhaps it was never meant to last beyond the night, only long enough to change the air. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen.
It is said that the day does not end when the sun disappears. It ends when a door closes. Not a grand date, not a palace seal, a simple household door, wooden, weathered, fitted into mudbrick with the stubborn patience of ordinary craft. It has been pushed open 1,000 times. It has been nudged shut with the heel, drawn inward with a quiet hand, held for a moment as if listening for the street's last breath. This final chapter begins with a single act. Dusk has softened the town. The air cools. The sky is neither gold nor night, but a bruised blue that seems to hold both at once. A faint wind carries sand and river scent together, mixing them into something ancient and familiar. Somewhere far away, a last voice rises and falls, then quiets. The courtyard, if there is one, releases its stored warmth like a slow exhale. And then the door moves. A hinge answers with a small, tired sound. Wood brushes wood. The gap narrows. Light becomes a thin blade, and then a thread. When the door meets its frame, the final sound is gentle, more acetylene than a slam. What did that sound mean to an Egyptian family? Safety first, a practical mercy. The night could hold thieves, animals, sudden weather, the wandering chaos that belongs to darkness. Even without imagining monsters, the simple truth is enough. You are more vulnerable when you cannot see. The door, closed at dusk, turns the home into a container of bodies, of breath, of heat, of hope. But the sound also means separation. The house withdraws from the street the way the mind withdraws from the day. Work is left outside, public obligations loosen. The loud world is politely refused. Inside the walls, the family's life becomes the only geography that matters. The sleeping mats, the water jar, the lamp, the niche, the corner where grain is stored, the place where an old grief still sits quietly. Beneath the silence, the door is not just wood. It is an idea made physical. It tells the household, now we are inside, now we are together, now the rules change. The narrative revisits familiar spaces, but they have shifted under evening's hand.
The kitchen corner is calmer now, its oven cooling, its ash settled into pale softness. The table is cleared or half cleared. A few crumbs remain, small evidence that the day succeeded in feeding the body. A jar rests in shadow with its mouth covered. A broom leans where it always leans. Nothing looks ceremonial, yet the stillness makes everything feel arranged. The courtyard's floor, if you step into it, is cooler than it was an hour ago. Dust holds faint traces, a dragged stool, a child's fast turn, a careful sweep. The walls surrounding the open sky seem higher at night, as if darkness adds weight. Above, the first stars appear, pinpricks that make the heavens feel nearer and more watchful. Now the lamp is lit, not bright, not defiant. It does not conquer night, it negotiates with it. The flame is modest, and its modesty is part of its power. It creates a circle of knowing. Outside the circle, shadows remain free to be shadows. Inside, a few objects regain their edges: clay, reed, wood, worn stone. The door, closed, changes the acoustics of life. Sound becomes intimate. The scrape of a mat unrolling is suddenly audible, meaningful. A cough is a louder event. A whispered prayer is not lost to open air. Even breathing seems clearer, as if the house has become a chamber for listening. And this is where the chapter deepens, because dusk was never only about sleep. In a culture that watched the sun die and return, every night carried the shape of a myth. Day and night were not simply lighting conditions, they were a cycle that mirrored the largest questions: disappearance and return, decay and renewal, the way life moves toward death and yet insists on continuity through memory and ritual. So the closing of the door becomes a small echo of that cosmic rhythm. A boundary is crossed. The family has spent the day in the visible world: work, speech, motion, heat. Now they enter the invisible hours, where other rules feel closer: dreams, omens, illness, the quiet presence of ancestors, the sense that unseen forces have more room to move when the sun is gone. The door is both barrier and blessing. A barrier because it holds back what does not belong. A blessing because it declares the home a protected space. Not protected perfectly, nothing is perfect,
but protected intentionally. The act says, we are not careless with our night. We do not fall into darkness. We step into it with care. You can feel this in the small bedtime rituals that begin once the door is shut. A latch set carefully, a final look at the threshold, a hand resting briefly on an amulet, not as superstition performed for others, but as reassurance performed for the self. A murmured line of gratitude, or a request, or a warning spoken softly so it won't invite attention. Some of this is practical, some of it is spiritual. In the home, the two are rarely separate. A woven mat is unrolled, a headrest is placed, a child is pulled closer to the center of warmth. The older bodies settle with a heaviness that is not sadness, just the honest weight of the day. Rest begins, but rest is never pure. Soft contradictions linger, the kind you can only hear when everything quiets down. Rest beside vigilance, trust beside fear. The door is closed, and still the mind listens. It listens for unusual sounds. It listens for the wrong kind of silence. It listens for a child's breathing to remain steady. It listens for the wind to change. The door can hold back a stranger, but it cannot hold back a fever. It can hold back a thief, but it cannot hold back a nightmare. It can hold back the street, but it cannot hold back memory. So the household makes peace with uncertainty. This is an important point to not romanticize. The ancient home was not a sealed sanctuary where nothing bad could happen. If you tell the story that way, you turn history into comfort merchandise. The real dignity is harsher. People built rituals and habits precisely because life was not guaranteed. The door closes at dusk because dusk is when vulnerability becomes obvious. And yet, there is tenderness in the act, because closing a door is also a declaration of belonging. It chooses who is inside. It gathers. It narrows the world to a circle small enough to hold. You can stand in your imagination at that doorway just before it shuts. The street is still there, but it is already fading. The home behind you feels warmer, quieter, closer. The door is about to turn noise into hush. The edge of the wood is worn smooth where hands have grasped it for years. In that worn place, you can sense generations without needing names. Where memory fades, touch remains. The wood remembers grip. The threshold remembers steps. The frame remembers every closing. Then the door meets the frame again, as it always has, and the sound is a soft punctuation. Inside, the house sleeps. Not immediately, not all at once. Sleep comes in waves, first in children, then in the tired, then in the watchful. Breathing slows. The lamp's flame steadies, then dips, then steadies again. Shadows shift gently, as if the house is adjusting its posture. Through a narrow opening, high near the roof, or through the courtyard's open sky, stars watch without blinking. The night is vast, the home is small, but the home is held, and that holding is a kind of victory. The closing reflection rests in stillness. You are left before the door, not outside, and not fully inside, at the threshold where so much human life has always happened. The door is a line drawn in earth and wood, a quiet argument against chaos, a daily rehearsal of endings. Perhaps it was never meant to be dramatic, only faithful. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and as your own breathing slows, you carry the sound with you. The gentle meeting of wood and frame, the way an ancient house gathered its people into the dark, the way dusk became a ritual without needing to be named.
As the night deepens along the Nile, lamps grow dim and voices soften. Families settle onto woven mats. The air cools. Tomorrow will come, as it always has, with light, work, and routine. But for now, the world rests. You don't need to follow the story any further. The homes fade, the river flows on, and sleep can take over from here. Thank you for spending this quiet time with Twilight Tale. May the calm of ancient nights stay with you, and may your rest be deep and unbroken. Good night.